On a calm April morning in Cotton Hill, Texas, a drone zipped across the sky and startled a cow chewing near the altar. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh-cut grass across the Henderson Ranch, where folding chairs were neatly arranged in rows facing an archway made of cedar branches and white ribbon. Walt Henderson stood a little ways off near the cattle fence, hands on his hips, his weathered hat casting a shadow over his brow. He squinted toward the barn, where his daughter Ellie moved between buckets of wildflowers with a focus only brides-to-be could summon. 2 years back, Karen Bellwether had fined him for painting that very barn, a shade she deemed non-compliant with community aesthetics. She hadn't even stepped foot on his land to ask. Just a folded letter in the mailbox with the HOA seal and a $250 demand. That memory came back now, not out of nowhere, but because folks like Karen didn't tend to act in single doses. She was more of a slow-release kind of trouble. Rick Donnelly shuffled up the porch steps holding a folded copy of the Cotton Hill Gazette and a silver thermos marked Mild to Wild, a gift from a long-defunct barbecue joint. He settled into the porch swing and poured a splash of coffee into the mismatched mug he always brought from home. "Mornin', Walt. Smells like wedding and cow pies out here," Rick drawled with a grin. "You sure this whole setup's not going to spook the livestock?" Walt let out a half-chuckle, half-sigh. "If the cows can handle thunder, they can handle table runners and mason jars." Ellie waved from the arch. "Dad, could you move the feeder to the south side? The photographer says the angle's better there." "Already done," Walt called back. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. There were a dozen things he'd rather do than smile for pictures, but seeing Ellie this happy made it worth the discomfort. Rick leaned back, feet on the railing. "You know, back when I got married, we had the reception in my uncle's hay barn, danced between 2 John Deeres and a pile of fertilizer sacks. Didn't stop us from hitting our 50-year mark." "That's because Janine had the patience of a church pew," Walt muttered, folding his arms. "Ellie wants something simple, but clean. She's doing good." "Better than good," Rick nodded, then paused mid-sip. "Oh." Company A silver SUV rolled up to the end of the driveway and came to a slow theatrical stop. The door opened, and out stepped Karen Bellwether in pressed khaki slacks and a pastel blouse too formal for country soil. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched perfectly, smile set like a showroom sample. Rick whispered, "And here I thought the only thing worse than a snake on your porch was a snake with stationery." Karen sauntered over, heels clicking against the gravel. "Walt, what a lovely scene," she said sweetly. "I do hope this isn't a surprise event. The HOA usually requires notice for large gatherings, especially when livestock are involved." Walt didn't respond right away. He watched Ellie in the distance, carefully positioning tablecloths over folding tables. He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself squarely between Karen and the view of the ceremony setup. "We're outside the HOA perimeter, Karen. Always have been." Karen offered a well-practiced chuckle. "Oh, I'm aware, but sound travels, and some of the neighbors are concerned about odors." Rick barked a short laugh. "That'd be the flowers. Bluebonnets can be mighty aggressive this time of year." Karen's smile tightened, but she recovered fast. "Well, just keeping an eye out for the community. You know how it is." As she turned to leave, clipboard tucked back under her arm, something above caught Rick's eye. A small buzz, like a mechanical bee. The shimmer of sunlight reflected off a spinning object darting near the treetops. "Well, I'll be," Rick murmured. "Tell me that's not hers." Walt followed his gaze. A compact drone hovered above the pasture, its black frame zipping slightly left, then right, then climbing with precision toward the sky. It paused over the arch Ellie had just decorated and drifted slowly toward a cluster of grazing cows. "I figured she'd start with a complaint, not surveillance," Walt muttered. "She's upping her game," Rick said, lifting the coffee mug again. "Next time she'll have lasers." The drone shifted in midair and descended slightly. One of the cows, an older brindle named Sugarbell, let out a low bleat and turned sharply, her tail swishing. The drone buzzed closer, wobbling in the wind. Sugarbell jerked sideways, bumping into another steer, which spun and trotted backward, right into the neat rows of white chairs. The crash was comical and slow, chairs tumbling in chain reaction, fabric and ribbon flying up like startled doves. Ellie gasped from the far end of the yard, hands on her mouth. Walt took one long, controlled breath. Rick, watching the chaos, shook his head and sipped again. "You sure that wasn't Karen's way of RSVPing early?" The next morning, the drone was back, this time lower, louder, and clearly recording. A rooster crowed from somewhere past the west fence, his call fading into the steady hum that drifted down from the sky. Walt stood on the porch with a hand shielding his eyes. The drone tilted like it was curious, its tiny lens trained directly on him. The air still held that soft April chill, the kind that warmed fast under Texas sunlight. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and a light breeze tugged at the makeshift tent Ellie had strung up for her gown. The fabric fluttered like a whisper, the train of her dress peeking out from beneath the canvas like a secret not yet told. Rick's voice from the day before still lingered in Walt's head. "Karen doesn't just dislike cows, she hates not being in control." And here she was again, not in person, but watching. Always watching. Ellie pushed open the screen door and stepped onto the porch with 2 mason jars of lemonade. She offered one to her father and sat beside him without a word. The drone buzzed a few feet above the fence line, drifting lazily from the barn to the clothesline. "They posted the rehearsal online," Ellie said quietly, staring out toward the pasture. Walt turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "Someone uploaded drone footage. You can see me arranging the tables. You, Rick, everything." Walt took a long sip before speaking. "Was it Karen's account?" "It was anonymous, but the caption said, 'Unauthorized livestock event. Whispering Pines HOA concerns confirmed.'" She gave a tired half-laugh. "Livestock event, like we're the circus." Walt stood, his boots creaking against the porch planks. "That's enough." He strode inside, grabbed the landline off the wall, and called Sheriff Tom Landry's direct line. After 3 rings, the sheriff picked up. "Morning, Walt." "Tom, I need to know what's legal when it comes to drones buzzing over my ranch." Sheriff Landry sighed. "Still got that flyer I gave you last fall? The one about recreational airspace?" "This isn't recreational. It's targeted. Unless it's flying into your home or physically damaging your property, there's not much I can do. We're in a gray area. State law says one thing, FAA says another. If it's causing harm, get proof." Video. Photos. Walt rubbed his forehead. "One of the cows panicked yesterday, crushed 2 rows of chairs." "Got it on camera?" "No." "Then it's just bad luck, Walt." The line went quiet for a moment. "I will say this," Tom added. "If she keeps poking, I won't blame you for creative pest control. Just keep it clean." As Walt hung up, a loud thud echoed from the yard. He stepped back onto the porch and saw Sugarbell again, rearing away from the arch Ellie had just rebuilt. The drone had dipped low, too low, and the cow had startled, knocking over the support poles. The arch tipped, and with a slow groan, collapsed into a heap of broken wood and flowers. Ellie covered her face, shoulders stiff. Walt clenched his jaw. An hour later, a familiar envelope was stuck into the mailbox at the end of the drive. Walt plucked it out, eyes narrowing at the HOA seal. He handed the folded letter to Ellie. She read it aloud, voice flat. "Due to recent concerns regarding safety, noise, and livestock proximity, the HOA formally recommends this event be moved off-site or reduced in scope. "Recommends," Walt muttered. "That's rich." Rick appeared from the barn path, wiping grease off his hands with a shop rag. "Guess who was spotted standing in her backyard this morning, remote in hand?" Walt didn't respond. "Yep," Rick confirmed. "Karen, her son's old football buddy, lives across the creek. Says she was grinning like she just aced a spelling bee." Inside the house, the screen door banged softly. Ellie had gone back in, no doubt to salvage what she could. Walt didn't follow. Instead, he stepped off the porch and crossed the yard toward the barn. He paused under the big oak tree, where the clothesline stretched between two posts. The white garment bag with Ellie's dress swayed gently, catching the sun. He looked up. The drone hovered directly above it, silent, watching. For a moment, Walt didn't move. Then, slowly, he walked beneath the drone, his shadow long and straight in the morning light. The machine made a slight adjustment, angling downward, lens fixed on him again. Back on the porch that evening, Walt and Ellie sat with fresh glasses of lemonade. The sky was pinking at the edges. A few guests would start arriving tomorrow. The tent had been restaked, the arch rebuilt. "Mom would have told me to let it go," Ellie said softly. Walt smiled faintly. "She also would have told Karen where to stick that clipboard." Ellie laughed under her breath. "True." They sat in silence a while. Then Walt leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "If she wants a show, maybe it's time we give her one. I once downed a wasp nest with nothing but molasses and a hose pump," Rick said, grinning over his mug. Walt didn't reply right away. He stood behind the barn, hands in his back pockets, looking at the canvas tarp that had been keeping the old crop duster covered for nearly 5 years. A breeze stirred the edges, revealing a corner of chipped yellow paint beneath. Dust floated in the golden light like particles of memory. Karen's smirk still lingered in his mind, the one she wore when she handed over that letter from the HOA, knowing it would sting. She didn't need to shout or storm. That woman weaponized politeness like a scalpel. Walt clenched his jaw as he stepped forward and peeled the canvas back. The plane sat quiet, its metal body dulled but intact. It looked tired, like something that hadn't been asked to matter in a long while. Rick took another sip of coffee, then pointed to a wooden crate beside his workbench. "That's the mix: molasses base for stick, marigold oil for smell, and food dye for flair. I used the blue that stains fence posts for a week. Should do just fine clogging a rotor or two." Walt raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Rick nodded. "Serious enough to name it. Check the crate." Walt glanced over. On the side, carved in jagged letters, was Plan B. Rick gave a satisfied snort. Felt appropriate. "Karen's gonna scream sabotage." "Karen screams when she burns toast. Let her." From the barn doors, Ellie stepped out, holding a small ring of keys. She walked over, hand outstretched, eyes on the plane. "It still runs?" Walt hesitated. "Haven't started it since." "I know," Ellie said gently. "But if this is how we keep her from ruining everything, I trust you." Walt took the keys, turning them over in his palm. The metal was warm from Ellie's hand. He remembered flying the duster early in the mornings, long before sunrise, his wife sitting on the porch with a blanket and a coffee, waving like she was seeing him off to war. The hum of the engine used to mean something. It used to mean he was building something. Inside the barn, they got to work. Rick adjusted the old spray nozzles, muttering to himself as he cleaned them with pipe cleaners and a toothbrush. Walt siphoned fuel, checked the ignition cables, cleaned bird nests out of the wheel well. It was quiet work, comforting in a way. Focused, grounded. Ellie slipped in and out, fetching rags, handing over tools, brushing dust from the seat cushions. At one point, Walt looked up to see her leaning on the doorframe, arms crossed, watching with a faint smile. "You were younger than me when you bought this," she said. "Felt older," Walt replied. Rick called from the back, "You two want to reminisce or fight injustice?" They chuckled. The laughter wasn't loud, but it settled into the corners of the barn like sunlight. By mid-afternoon, the plane's engine coughed to life, sputtering once, twice, then roaring steady. The barn vibrated with its pulse. Rick clapped his hands and whooped like a teenager. Walt just stood there, staring at the spinning propeller, remembering everything and nothing at once. Outside, they rigged a quick test. Rick tied an empty coffee can to the tail of a kite and sent it into the air while Walt stood below, spraying a short burst from a pressurized canister they'd hooked to the plane's system. The molasses mix hit dead on. The can spun in the breeze, dripping sticky blue syrup. "Perfect," Rick declared. "Can't ruin electronics if they're coated in breakfast." As they wheeled the plane back into hiding behind the barn, Rick waved a folded piece of paper in the air. "Almost forgot. Got the latest HOA newsletter. Look who made the front page." He unfolded it on the workbench. Grainy black and white drone stills filled half the page, including one of Ellie at the altar arch and another of Rick sipping coffee. Ellie frowned. "Where did they get this?" Rick tapped the corner. "Someone's been logging drone flights like they're scouting for Google Earth." Walt stared at the photo of himself fixing a chair. "They've already written the narrative." "Then it's time we edit the story," Rick said, "with pictures they won't be proud of." Later that evening, with the barn secured and the plane cleaned up, Walt stepped out into the dusk. He looked at the porch where a single lantern flickered. Ellie had already gone in, but he could hear her humming faintly through the screen. He turned back to Rick, who was wiping his hands with a rag. "Not for revenge," Walt said, almost to himself, "but for respect." Rick gave a single nod, then glanced at his phone. "You may want to see this." Walt leaned over. On the screen was a message from the HOA Community Board. Announcement: Whispering Pines. HOA invites all residents to a community clean air flyover, April 27th, during a special neighborhood gathering. Open skies, open hearts. Karen had set her stage, and it was timed exactly during the wedding. The sun hung high over Cotton Hill as Ellie walked down the aisle, and overhead the faint hum of rotors grew louder. Every folding chair was filled, every head turned to watch Ellie make her way across the grassy aisle, lined with wildflowers and burlap runners. The spring afternoon had warmed into a pleasant hush, the kind of stillness that makes every whisper feel important. Walt stood at the altar in a charcoal vest and clean boots, his hands folded loosely in front of him, gaze steady as Ellie approached with slow, deliberate steps. For a moment, everything felt untouched, pure. Then the buzzing crept in, subtle at first, like a mosquito just out of reach. Walt's eyes narrowed as he caught the shimmer above the treetops. Rick's voice echoed from memory. "If she flies during the vows, we fly louder." Walt glanced subtly toward the back of the property. Karen stood just beyond the fence, dressed in lavender and pearls, holding a tablet like a hostess checking seating charts. The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite smirk. The drone, sleek and matte black, descended like a mechanical hawk, gliding in smooth figure eights above the altar. Ellie's voice trembled slightly as she recited her vows. A few guests tilted their heads upward, murmuring. The officiant hesitated mid-sentence when the drone swooped lower, its camera lens aimed directly at the bride's bouquet. That was enough. Walt gave the faintest nod toward Rick, who was already standing near the shed. The old man disappeared behind the door without a word. Walt took Ellie's hands and smiled gently as she continued. But when the next vow was said, he whispered to the officiant, then to Ellie, and stepped back slowly from the altar. He didn't run, didn't stomp. He simply turned, buttoned his vest, and walked with purpose toward the barn. From behind the rows of seated guests came a low mechanical rumble, familiar to some, confusing to most. Then came the sharp whine of an engine catching, followed by the throaty growl of something old and powerful coming to life. The crop duster emerged from behind the shed, wheels bouncing lightly as it crossed the back pasture. Its yellow frame caught the sun, propeller gleaming like a spinning badge. Guests gasped, some standing, some raising phones instinctively. Karen's expression faltered. Walt was at the helm, calm as ever, head set on, eyes locked forward. He pulled back the throttle, and the plane lifted off with a smooth arc, banking wide over the property. The drone shifted in midair as if startled. It adjusted altitude to meet him. Walt circled once, gaining position. Rick stood by the edge of the pasture with a walkie-talkie and a grin. The crate labeled Plan B sat open beside him, a hose running to the tank beneath the plane's belly. At the next pass, Walt flipped the release switch. A stream of thick, shimmering blue and amber liquid sprayed in a perfect arc, catching the drone squarely across its midsection. The crowd let out a collective gasp as the machine jerked midair, wobbled, then spiraled downward like a swatted fly. It landed headfirst into the punch bowl with a slosh and a shower of ruined sherbet. A second later, the guests burst into laughter. Karen took an instinctive step backward, but too late. The tail end of the molasses dye mix hit the breeze just right, and a fine mist coated her blouse, arms, and hair in streaks of sticky color. Her tablet slipped from her hand and landed in the dirt with a soft thump. Someone clapped, then another. Then the whole crowd joined in, applause rippling across the pasture like a revival tent gone rogue. Ellie blinked at the altar, a mixture of shock and barely contained joy crossing her face. The officiant, uncertain, cleared his throat and asked, "Shall we continue?" Karen stormed forward, trying to find footing in heels sunk into soft earth. Her voice carried across the yard. "This is outrageous! I'll have charges!" But before she could finish, she reached for the tablet and accidentally knocked it against the chair leg. The screen cracked. She turned in time to see Walt landing the plane at the far end of the field. As he stepped out, she pointed a shaky, dye-streaked finger toward him. You'll answer for this!" Sheriff Tom had been leaning against a fence post near the reception tables, quietly sipping sweet tea. He straightened, adjusted his hat, and walked over slowly, saying nothing. Karen reached for the tablet again. But as she fumbled with it, she tilted the screen just enough for Walt to catch the image reflected in the glare. A live feed view and a still of the drone's camera overlay, which included targeting software she definitely wasn't supposed to be using. More importantly, her fingers slipped on the touchpad. For one flicker of a moment, everyone could see the controller interface. And Sheriff Tom saw it too. Karen's shoulders tensed, eyes darting to Walt, then the sheriff, then back to the crowd, who had grown silent again. Karen storms off, but not before Walt sees her fumble with the drone controller in plain sight of Sheriff Tom. Karen arrived the next morning with her hair still dyed pink and a 3-ring binder labeled Violation Evidence. The sun hadn't fully climbed the sky yet, and the morning breeze still carried the scent of overturned chairs and stomped petals. Walt sat on the porch swing, a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The field in front of him was quiet now, just rows of empty folding chairs, a few crumpled napkins, and a wedding arch leaning ever so slightly, like it had survived a minor storm. Rick stepped outside with a smirk already in place, cradling a small black SD card between his thumb and forefinger. "Got it out before the punch soaked through," he said, holding the card up like a hunter displaying a trophy. Karen's drone gave us a little wedding gift of its own. They didn't wait long. Karen's SUV pulled up in its usual gravel-spitting flourish. The driver's side door swung open, and out she came, walking with quick, sharp steps across the yard in heels far too pointed for soft dirt. The pink streaks in her hair clashed boldly with her lavender blazer. Walt stood as she approached. "I'd like to speak to you formally," she announced, waving the binder like a baton. "On record." Walt nodded toward the porch swing. "Plenty of room." "I'll stand," Karen sniffed, glancing at Rick with disdain before opening the binder. "As you're both aware, yesterday's incident qualifies as chemical assault under HOA bylaws, subsection 12.3. You intentionally discharged a foreign substance in a community airspace." Rick took a long sip of his coffee. "You mean on your drone? That was trespassing." Karen snapped the binder shut. "You can't prove it was my drone." "That's funny," Walt said calmly, "because we can." Sheriff Tom's cruiser rolled up right on cue, kicking up dust behind it. He parked, stepped out, and adjusted his hat with his usual unbothered manner. "Morning," he greeted as he approached. "Karen, Walter Rick." Karen turned toward him, already mid-gesture. "Sheriff, I'd like to formally request a citation be issued for unlawful aerial spraying. It endangered me, several guests, and private property." Sheriff Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he raised a hand and nodded toward Rick. Rick handed him the SD card. "Recovered it from the drone wreckage. Thought you might want to take a look." The sheriff slid the card into a reader connected to his tablet and tapped the screen a few times. A moment later, faint audio crackled to life. Karen's voice, unmistakable, clear as glass. No, the crying has to look real. Watch, like this." A pause, then exaggerated sniffles. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she crooned in mock despair. "We're all just so tired of the noise and mess and livestock-themed events." Rick leaned over to Walt. She missed her calling in theater. Walt didn't laugh. He just watched Karen. The sheriff's brow arched slightly as he continued to scroll through footage. Another clip played, Karen standing in her backyard, drone controller in hand, pointing at a map pinned to a corkboard. HOA members flanked her, nodding like accomplices. Karen's face paled. That was taken out of context." "Seems pretty clear to me," Sheriff Tom said evenly. "Coordinated drone surveillance, unregistered flight path, unauthorized public distribution of footage, and intent to disrupt a private event." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but her phone buzzed in her purse. Then again. And again. Walt recognized the sound of a social media notification flood. Rick pulled his own phone from his pocket and smirked. "She's viral." Karen tried to speak, but her words were lost behind the buzz of the sheriff's radio and the subtle chuckles from a few neighbors who had started gathering by the gate. A teenage boy holding a half-eaten breakfast taco called out, "Hey, is that you crying in the drone video? My mom's watching it on Facebook right now." The air thickened with a kind of quiet reckoning. Karen stood straighter, but even she couldn't hide the twitch in her jaw. Sheriff Tom cleared his throat. "Karen Bellwether, I'm placing you under temporary suspension from your role as HOA president pending investigation. A review of Whispering Pines, HOA governance will follow immediately. I suggest you step away until then." Karen didn't speak. She simply turned, binder clutched tightly, and walked back toward her SUV. A few neighbors made a point of looking away as she passed, suddenly unsure which side of the fence they'd been standing on. Just before she reached the door, she stopped. Her voice, quieter this time, still found its way across the driveway. "This isn't over." From near the porch, the teenager took another bite of taco and shouted with a grin, "You're trending again." 2 weeks later, the ranch was quiet again. No buzzing, no drones, just birds and wind through the grass. The sun was sliding down the sky, painting long amber streaks across the Henderson pasture. A few stray white chairs still leaned against the barn wall, waiting to be folded and stored, but no one was in much of a rush. The wedding was behind them, the drama settled, and the land had returned to its rhythm. On the porch, Walt and Rick sat in matching rockers, glasses of iced tea sweating gently in their hands. A breeze rustled the wind chimes, their soft clinks blending with the call of meadowlarks. Somewhere out in the field, a calf bellowed half-heartedly at a butterfly. Walt watched the horizon, his voice low. "She used to say this land isn't just dirt, it's our history." Rick nodded without looking up. "Smart woman." "Every time I think I've got it all figured out, something like this happens. Reminds me I'm just a caretaker passing through." "Caretakers don't fly crop dusters full of molasses, Walt." Walt chuckled. "Guess not." From down the gravel road came the soft growl of an old pickup. Sheriff Tom passed by in his cruiser, one arm out the window. He tipped his hat as he rolled past, no clipboard in sight. Rick raised his glass. "That man's got more patience than a catfish in a drought," Rick muttered. "Comes with knowing when to look away and when to pay attention," Walt replied. A soft creak behind them signaled Ellie's return. She stepped out onto the porch, a small wooden frame in hand. Her smile was easy, her hair still damp from a shower, and a tan line had begun to bloom on her shoulder, a souvenir from her brief honeymoon in the hill country. "Look what came in today," she said, holding up the photo. It was a shot from the wedding, Ellie and her husband beneath the arch, sunlight threading through the trees, Walt just behind them, face uncharacteristically soft. She climbed a small step ladder and hung it under the porch light, the exact spot where her mother's favorite photo once lived. "Looks right," Walt murmured. "I thought so too." A rustle by the front gate drew their attention. A man in a blue HOA polo approached, holding a pie tin wrapped in foil. Mike, the new HOA president, looked more like a friendly pharmacist than someone in charge of rules. He paused at the fence, uncertain. Rick whistled. "Now that's either a peace offering or an elaborate trap." Mike smiled. "It's pecan. My wife made it. Thought I'd stop by." Walt stood and waved him in. "Appreciate it. And the vote." "Whole board turned over," Mike said, passing the tin. "Karen resigned after the clip hit 1 million views. Board's being audited, but folks wanted me to say thanks for standing your ground and for not letting the mess ruin Ellie's day." Ellie joined them, accepting the pie with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Mike." Mike tipped his cap, then turned to go. "If you ever want to host another wedding, we'll waive the permit. Just keep the molasses grounded." Rick slapped his knee. "You hear that, Walt?" "They're learning." Later, as twilight deepened and crickets began to chirp, Rick wandered over to the crop duster parked just inside the barn. He ran a finger along its frame and squinted at the fuselage. "You think if we paint a little drone silhouette on the side, it'd be bragging?" "Too subtle," Walt replied. "Might need a whole swarm." Rick grinned and grabbed a paintbrush from the workbench. Just before night settled, Walt climbed into the cockpit. Ellie watched from the fence, arms wrapped around herself, content. With a few taps and a low rumble, the plane rolled forward and lifted gently into the air. This time, there was no urgency, no target, just bags of wildflower seed and a fresh tank of spring water in the spray lines. From above, the pasture looked golden and soft, the land wide and open like it had always been. Walt circled once, then released the seed mix in long, graceful arcs, letting it fall like blessings over the grass. The plane dipped low, then pulled up toward the orange horizon. Back on the porch, Rick leaned back and sighed. "Think she'll try it again?" Walt's voice crackled through the handheld radio, smooth and amused. "Not unless she wants a molasses encore." 2 weeks after the dust settled, the Henderson Ranch stood quiet again. No buzzing, no drama, just wind in the grass and stories in the soil. What began as a simple wedding became a reminder that land isn't just property. It's memory, legacy, and love stitched into every fence post. Sometimes the strongest stand is made not with anger, but with grace, persistence, and a little help from good neighbors. And when justice comes wrapped in wildflower seeds and a molasses haze, well, that's a Texas kind of poetry, because in the end, the land remembers who stood for it, and so do the people.